So, Francisco, what is one thing you want people to stop doing when they tell stories?
One thing. Oh, there's so many things. There's so many. There's just so many.
Okay, start with one and then give us your top three
Okay, so
or
I'm gonna
five.
fine. So I'm gonna give you just a couple that are they just should be super easy to fix and they're not complicated. I don't need to go into massive detail, but these things drive me insane. So the first one is stop introducing stories saying that I'm going to tell you a story, right? That
Let
is
me
a pretty
tell you a
common one.
story.
Yes, yes. So I met these guys from the company is called Anecdote, and they used to call this the S word. That don't say the S word, right? And it's just this idea that a lot of people associate stories with something that is fictional, that is a childish thing. Like I'm going to tell you a story now. There's just no point in doing it, and it just drives me mad. It's like, oh, I'm going to tell you a story now.
Or they feel like, oh, now comes the story. Now he's working us,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
that's in a
yeah.
more corporate world
Yeah.
these days. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just pointless. The other thing is when people change their voice to tell stories, and the whole idea of like, and yesterday, whatever. No, 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 no. You don't talk like that. No, stop right now. Stop. Right, whatever you're doing, stop right now. And something that kind of goes along with that is this slightly more poetic or literary language, which can work very well in writing, but doesn't work at all when you speak. People start talking about like, the moonlights were shining on the leaves and whatever. It's like, yeah, fine, but it's very, very difficult to make that work if you're telling a story in a conversational way. So that's sort of a weird language thing. I tend to think of those two things as the story weirdo. The person who does this is the story weirdo. It's like, oh, I have a great story for you. Many years ago when I was just a young little boy. Right? It's like, no, don't do any of those things. Right? So those are easy. Right? Those
Yeah.
are very easy. If I think about things that are slightly less obvious, I think most people can kind of tell that those are not great, but things that are slightly less obvious. So the first and perhaps biggest one of all is telling something they think is a story that is not a story. Okay, now we talked about my definition of a story. It's a real life example that makes a point. And the way most people go wrong is that they think that if they talk about a time in their lives, that will be naturally a story. So, I as a kid, I grew up in Brazil. My family didn't have much money. I went to this type of school. It's like, that is not a story. There are just a whole bunch of facts about my growing up. Now, maybe there's a story in there somewhere, but telling you about how I was like as a kid, what my relationship with my brother was like, what my relationship with my parents was like, none of that is an actual story. And a lot of people sometimes fall into that.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's a very common mistake, right? To feel that way. And I'm curious if you've run into the reasons why people end up thinking that that's a story. Do your clients, for example, share like where that comes from for them?
I think that the longest I work at this, the more I come around to the idea that we have no problem telling people things that happen to us. Okay, I was in university and my teacher told me this crazy thing, and I was at a party and I saw this weird thing happening. We have no problem realizing those things are interesting and sharing them with someone else.
So we're just listing facts, right? Up to here.
No. So no. What I mean is, what I would call a story, which is this thing that just happened to you at a party, right? You tell it to someone, and then you find a point about it. Okay, so we are very good at sharing things that happen to us with people we spend time with. Okay, we all do this naturally, but we don't think of that as a story. If I were to ask you, do you have any stories from the last week? Your brain is gonna go, right? But if I ask you, do you have stories from when you were younger? You will probably remember the same 2 or 3 stories you told everyone you know about maybe when you went on an adventure, when you just started living in a different country, right? So there's this disconnect between the supposedly small thing that happens every day and what a story actually is. And we are thinking of bigger events in our lives, right? That time I broke into a Radiohead concert and hid in the bathroom for hours, right? That most people would think of as a story. They wouldn't necessarily think of as a story is my kid said something and sent my head in a spin about being a good parent or not. They wouldn't think of that as a story. So there's this disconnect between what is a story and the types of things they normally think of as a story. That means people think, if I tell you about a period of my life, that is a story. I'm telling you about I'm telling you a story about my childhood. I was like, but no, you're telling me how it was in general. Right? You might even tell me how it was when you went to school, but unless you narrow it down, it doesn't become a story.
So what I'm hearing is what difference you're making is between a kind of a broad period of time and a really fine slice of time. So that one time I did something, or that one day my teacher said XYZ.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is, I think, the best way I can explain it, and perhaps what I should have started with. If you want to tell me how crazy your family is, don't tell me about your whole childhood. Tell me about one Thanksgiving dinner.
So one scene, one moment in time.
That's it. Tell me what happened in one Thanksgiving dinner. That's a story that illustrates a whole bunch of stuff about you or your family or childhood, whatever. If you want to tell me about the toxic job you had, don't tell me how it was for 6 months. Tell me maybe how one performance review with your jerk boss went. Okay? So that is a story that informs us about a much larger period in your life. So in a way, there's a lot of things that your life was like. That's not a story. The story is one thing that happened during that period that perhaps illustrates to us what your life was like. Okay, so telling me about your whole childhood, that's not a story. Telling me about one thing in your childhood, that is a story. And most people, they just don't know what they're doing there, and it's very easy to start talking and talking and talking, and I'm listening going, that's not a story. Right? I'm still waiting for the story to start, and it hasn't started. Not telling a story, thinking you're telling a story, is by far the biggest mistake that I see a lot of people that talk about storytelling everywhere doing. And just fixing that goes a long way to actually, well, if you haven't fixed that, you're not telling a bad story, you're just not telling a story at all.
Right. Yeah. I think this is really a key element of storytelling, like this moment in time thing, because it's so easy to think, like, we had this conversation just last week when we talked about the story of the Harvard Man study, where Robert Waldinger was talking about what the steps were in setting up the study and so on. And he was just listing a timeline, right? He wasn't actually telling a story about the study.
Joe, I realize you said last week, but
yeah, that's right.
Who knows if it was last week? It could have been last month. It could have been
the
2 days ago.
other day when we talked about
yes. Who knows when we record these things, right? Let's not break the fourth wall, shall we?
You're right. Okay, so let me do that again.
No, by all means. I'm just messing with you.
Hey, remember that one time when we did this recording and you were messing with me?
Yes. Well, I think so many examples of that one. Pick one. So that is exactly what a lot of people do, right? Like Francisco and I record most weeks, and every time we record, he messes with me. He says things, and then I try to respond, and it's not like that is not a story. The story is last week, yesterday Francisco and I were recording, and I said this, and he started picking me up on it, and he's like, Joe, don't break the fourth wall, and that would be a story. Okay, so that is...
Yeah. That's a great example. You're welcome, everybody. So, big mistake number one, moment in time. What else?
The other one would be that your story either doesn't have a problem or it's not enough of a problem. Now, I think most people probably understand that it needs to have some sort of complication, at least something unexpected, right? But where I think a lot of people go wrong is what I tend to think of as the nobody cares about your marathon problem, which is the problem you're sharing in your story is just an external problem. I'm running this marathon for which I practiced for a long time, and I don't think I'm going to finish, right? And that's a problem. And I'm going, okay, why is that a problem? Oh, because it sucks. I trained hard. I want to finish it. I was like, oh, I don't care about your marathon, right? That's not a real problem. What needs to happen is you need to tell me, why does that really matter for you? Because the reason it matters for you might be very different than the reason it matters to anyone else in the world, right? And I remember when the first time I came upon this, I was in the MBA, as I'm in class, and the student gives me this story, and I'm like, I don't really care about the marathon. And then I'm like, why does this actually matter? And I think her answer was something along the lines of, well, I used to be really into sports, and then I got, COVID happened. I remember if she got long COVID or if she just got COVID. And it says, I got COVID, I couldn't run for a long time. And it took me a long time to get myself, get up the nerve to like start practicing again, because I felt weak. And a lot of my identity was tied up with being a runner. And the longer it went on for, the longer I started like not feeling sure about myself. And once I finally started running, I got a little better. I started training for a marathon, and then I'm in the middle of this marathon. I'm trying to finish it, and it's really important for me that I finish, because that will prove to me that I'm not broken. Yeah. I'm like, okay, that's a lot more interesting, right? Because this is just about failure. It's about you letting yourself down. It's about who you think you are to the world.
Changing identities, yeah.
Yeah, so that is a problem you as the character cares about. And if you care about, almost certainly the feeling that is connected to that is something that will be relatable to me as the audience. And this is the reason why you can make movies about astronauts and have people care. Not because we are also astronauts or because we're involved into some very complex scientific endeavor and we really know what it is like to fail at something that costs $150 million. But maybe you wanted to be an astronaut because you wanted to prove to your dad that you're not a complete washout, right? A lot of people can relate to that. Maybe you have a family that looks up to you and you don't want to let them down. So those are the relatable feelings, and that's the problem most people make. They think of an external problem, an obstacle to be overcome, but they either don't think about or don't make it clear to us, why do they care about that problem?
So the internal problem.
The internal problem, yes.
Right.
They don't think about the internal
emotional
problem.
stakes that we can all relate to. Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The emotional stakes.
So how could people get better just by maybe flipping a switch? Like we offered a switch earlier from, extended period of time to a moment in time. What could be a switch here?
They just need to tell us. It takes one sentence. The sentence of, for example, in the marathon one was perhaps a slightly longer example, right? But very often you watch a character in a movie and they just say something. I mean, in the movie they probably have shown us that the character, for example, had a bad relationship with their dad or whatever, right? And they just show that as part of the character growing up. And then at some point, in a 10-minute
keynote, that can be difficult.
Some point as they're an astronaut and they're gonna go on space, and they just like put in a call and say, Dad, they chose me. I'm going up in space. And the dad says something like, don't screw this up, son. Right? And that tiny bit of dialogue is like, okay, you know what was important to the astronaut. And you also know what the relationship is a bit like. And once it starts going wrong, you know what's going on in his head. It's like, I can't screw this up because otherwise I'm going to prove my father that he's right and I am a screw up. Right? So in a story that you're telling, all you need to say is, and when I do that, my dad is the first person I'm going to call, and that will show him. That's it, right?
So you're not translating the emotion per se.
Not necessarily.
You're just giving the emotion a voice. Right, so that you
could translate it, right?
Type of thing.
You could translate it. You could just say, as that started happening, I just thought of my family back home, and I just don't think I would be able to look my kid in the eye and said, I just gave up. It was too hard, right? Okay. That's it, right? That's all you need to do. It's just, so if this matters to you, why? Because I don't want to let my kids down. Okay, you talk about your wife, talk about your kids. Okay, like what would that look like? Well, I'd have to get home. I'd have to tell them something I don't want to tell them. I'd see the look in their eyes. That little detail. Okay, just give us that, right? And if you're not particularly skillful at this thing, just say. And the reason I didn't want to do this is because of whatever. There's a story. I tell about my kind of losing my cool and shouting at my kids. And I say something like, when my kid starts crying, I was horrified because I remember being shouted at when I was a kid, and I didn't want to be one of those fathers. That's it, right? I've gave you a lot of internal stuff in there. You can extrapolate if you want
Yeah.
to different, what is your mom, your dad, whatever. But I've given in that one line, I've told you why it's important for me to build a better relationship or communicate better with my kids. Okay, so you don't need to be super skillful. Just imply very strongly, or just tell us. I don't want to see that happen because, like, I really want to make this work because.
Yeah, this is
right?
important to me because.
Because
Yeah.
that's it.
Right. And then this way of just giving the emotion a voice rather than naming it, right? Because I don't want to feel like a failure, or because I couldn't bear the look in my kids' eyes. They're very different ways of saying the same thing. So the
One is
second one would
skillful.
be like, the next
One is
level.
skillful, the other is less so.
Right.
I mean, in a perfect world, this is why I like using dialogue, right? I like using dialogue, even if it's with yourself, because dialogue is less on the nose, right? You can say something that packs a lot of emotional punch without having to actually spell it out, which can be just bad writing at times. No, but again, a lot of people are not necessarily super good writers, and that's fine. But if you can have the dialogue, or just put some visual to it, right? So disappointment, failure, what does that look like? It could just be, okay, let's say if you get sacked from the job, right? What does that mean? Well, it means I'm going to have to spend, I don't want to be that guy spending every weekend on LinkedIn, engaging with people I don't care about in hopes that somebody gives me a job.
Right. In Gestalt, we would call this phenomenology. So I love that you're doing this, because you're translating all of these interpretations and feelings and everything going on inside into observable behaviors, right? Observable language in dialogue, obviously. And everybody can feel kind of that tug in your gut, right? When you're feeling a certain way and you're describing what's happening, but without actually having to name it. And I think that's really satisfactory as the audience, to be able to decode something yourself from what you can observe in terms of behaviors or wording, or very cool.
One of the contexts where that shows up is when it comes to feelings, right? So you can name the feeling, but it's much more interesting to name what the feeling feels like, right? So you can say, I think it's much more interesting to say a dry mouth and sweaty palms than say I'm nervous or I'm anxious, right? If there is a repetitive behavior you do, that there is this copywriter I like a lot called Eddie Schleiner, and there is this little short story that he tells about when he was waiting for his son to be born, right? And it was a difficult birth. He's picking at his nail, right? Not his nail, at his cuticle, right? The little white bit on the nail. He's just picking at it, and he's picking at constantly at it. And he keeps telling us that he's picking at it. And at some point starts bleeding, and then he sucks on his thumb to stop the bleeding. And he at no point says that he's really, really nervous, but just a constant picking at his finger until it bleeds. It's so obvious that he's really, really anxious about his wife and his kid being okay. And that's just more interesting. Now, it doesn't always work as well when you speak than when you write, but you can say things like, I just didn't know what to do. I just kept refreshing, jumping between my email and social media and the news website over and over and over for an hour.
Yeah, but I mean, language has so much to offer. We have so many of these expressions, like biting my nails, on the edge of my seat. I felt punched in the stomach. Like, these are really regular expressions that people, I think, will use in their everyday storytelling without thinking that they're telling a story, to your point. Yeah.
And I think that leads us nicely to the third mistake that I think about, which is, there's two sides of it, right? It's to do with details, right? So a very common problem is people don't use enough details. They would talk in generalities, right? They would say, I had a terrible day at work. Okay, I think we all understand what a terrible day at work can be, but it's so much more interesting if you just tell us one thing that happened in this terrible day at work, right? Whatever that might be. It might be that I had spent weeks preparing this presentation, and I was really concerned I was going to bomb when I got in front of the board to present it. But it was worse. They just canceled it half an hour before. And they just said, well, what's the point anyway? They're just not going to go for that idea, right? So something along those lines, something along that, it would be so much more interesting than just say I had a terrible day at work. And people don't often do that. We were talking just now about, the feeling, what does it feel like and what's the observable behavior. So instead of telling us, I just had I was so upset that day just sucked. What did you do in that day that sucked, right? Did you sit and stare at a wall? Did you watch some crap on TV or on the computer for hours on end? Did you just eat all the bad food you had in your house that you're not supposed to be eating, trying to eat away your nervousness? Tell us that, because that is substantially more interesting and feels more real than just give us something general like, that day was terrible, it really sucked. This is very common. People just don't give you the details that would have made it a lot more interesting. And the other side of that problem is too many details. And one of the most common ways this manifests is when they think that they need to paint a picture of what is happening and start giving you so many visual or auditory cues that one, it just feels very difficult to follow. And two, it starts sounding very, very artificial, right? Right now I am sitting in my living room, and to my left there's a very big window and the sun is coming through and I can see the ocean in the distance. But if I look to the other side, there is a sofa, there are some clothes hanging out. Like, do I want to say that I have a nice living room that is a bit messy? Right? I can just say that and let you imagine it, because none of these details are important. Right? I can just say, I walked into my office. Imagine whatever office you want. Like
it was a mess.
It was a mess.
Yeah.
Unless the mess is really important to the story, there's no real point in spending 30 seconds describing the mess, because I'm going to go, was that important? Right? Because you go into a lot of detail about this. Should I be remembering these things? Right? And then it just slows the story down.
So we should choose details intentionally to support the point that we want to make in the story. Otherwise, the details don't matter.
Yes. And the details, too many details often go along with the thing I mentioned right at the beginning, which is being a story weirdo, right? Which is no one talks that way, right? No one over dinner with a friend would tell a story laying out. Like you just say, so I was at home the other day and my boss called, and like you wouldn't describe even if your friend doesn't know your home, right? If you said, I was spending the weekend at an Airbnb, my wife and I got in the mountains, you wouldn't describe the Airbnb unless it's important to the story. You don't go, this is a really nice ski lodge, and it had like 2 floors, and it was all wood, and there was a deer head on the wall. Like, unless any of that is important, you just say, like this ski lodge we rented for the weekend, and my boss called, because the boss calling is the important thing. It's not a ski lodge. So yeah, too many details, not enough details. So a bad use of details is the...
Where do you see this in more businessy type of talks? How do you see these things playing out? Yeah,
in businesses, usually the way this manifests is a little less trying to paint a visual picture of whatever you're talking about. What it happens more often than that is people start giving you every single little bit of context that they think might be important for the thing they're going to present, right? So they will feel, okay, I'm going to tell you that we are in this project. And instead of focusing on why are we doing this, how is this any different than what we normally do, and what are conclusions have you gotten after you've gone through this experiment or whatever, they will start going, well, I work in this department. And then they'll start telling you about what the department does, what they don't do, whereas you could have probably just left all that out, or you could have said, 3 weeks ago, we started doing this because it's the type of thing my department does, right? Or, whatever. It's not what we normally do, but the board told us it was really important. And what we found is this, right? So they will give a lot of context, or in giving the right presentation, the right story, they will start adding details about the people involved, about competitors. And sometimes that is important, but more often than not, they're just filling time with things that are not what the audience usually either wants to know or needs to know.
Filling time, or maybe building up their credibility, kind of consolidating that image of a person who's prepared, who knows what they're talking about. I hear that a lot from clients. So how would you address this need for people, presenters, to actually consolidate their image in the company, for example, if it's for their colleagues or from a keynote stage, while still treating details with the intentionality that we were talking about?
So here we're talking about two slightly different things. So one of them is if we're talking about the story itself, right? Which, I'm talking about something that is going to last probably 3 minutes or so, maybe 5 minutes if it's a particularly long story. And if you need to address credibility in there, then I would just in passing say something like, for the last 3 years, every time this type of problem came up, it came to me or to my team, and we always managed to handle it. But this time, we always fixed it. But
okay, so a line that says, "I've done this before."
Yeah, this is in keynotes. I remember when I just started speaking, one of the first bits of advice I heard is to sort of include things like, if you can't use an actual story from one of your clients, like a case study type of thing, to just say, so when I go into companies to help executives with this particular thing, this problem comes up a lot, right? And they'll tell me this, and instead of just talking about, a lot of companies have this type of problem. You just go, so when I went in to this type of company, right? When I'm working with executives in the health sector, what they complain to me about is where do I find my stories, right? I don't know where I find it, right? So you can just sort of add the
subtle enough.
I mean, you could, I think the way I was actually taught to do this in a keynote was something like, when I go into companies, what I usually help them with is to do this, 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 and this. Now here, obviously, we've only got another 10 minutes left, right? There's no way I could show you all the things you really need to know to master this, but I can get you started, and this is how you do it.
Yeah. So, or let's focus on this one thing,
right? The most powerful thing I can teach you right now that will actually move the needle, and is this one. So I think that when it comes to story, just use one line. If you're looking for keynotes, you can drop things here and there. But I also there's also the question of where are you presenting, right? Because if you are presenting to inside a company, you shouldn't need to prove who you are and why you're there presenting. Normally,
you'd be surprised.
I guess depends on the company, depends on the type of presentation, right? But I tend to find that credibility is achieved a lot better by showing that you know your audience and knowing what their problem is and knowing what they normally try to do to fix it. So, in other words, using the framework that we tend to use when we help people design their keynotes, then you saying, I'm the world's greatest expert in this. Because I can say, I'm the world's greatest expert in whatever, but if in the first 10 minutes of my talk I haven't made it clear that I understand my audience's problem and how they normally go about it, they'll go, yeah, great, you're an expert, but not on us. You don't know what we are going through.
Yeah. Bingo.
So establish credibility by showing knowledge about the problem you're actually talking about. And then if you want to booster that credibility by dropping hints of other things you've done, other projects that have been successful, then do that. But you need to know your subject matter and the audience you're speaking to. If you don't nail that, there's no amount of CV. You can wave your CV around as much as you want. People are just going to go, oh, I thought this guy was really good, but he's actually an idiot. I don't know how he's made all his money or whatever.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, that we can definitely show credibility by demonstrating, not by declaring it.
Yeah.
Right.
So we talked in a different podcast about the point of the story, the lesson of the story not being earned. Right, so when we don't make it very clear how you got there. There's no character arc and all of that. And I don't wanna repeat that. I know that is a problem that happens a lot, where people don't make it super clear, where where the learning has come from, but I actually want to focus on something slightly related, which drives me completely insane when someone is just telling a story instead of doing something else, like a keynote. But when people tell stories and then end with a call to action telling me how to live my life because of the story they just told, and in the context of a keynote, yes, you want a story to feed into a bigger point, which you then substantiate with a whole bunch of other stuff than the story, right? Because the story is not proof of anything other than it happened to you or to someone else, and it has perhaps changed that person in a specific way. I don't get to tell you how to live, to have your relationship, to improve your relationship with your partner, because I learned how to do something that works for me and my partner. I can tell you what I learned.
Yeah, that's a sample of one, right?
I can tell you what I learned, right? Take it or leave it, right? Now, in the context of a keynote, the story needs to feed into other things, right? But if your keynote is based on this happened to me and this is why now I'm going to tell you how to live your life or run your business, it's a very poorly constructed keynote, right? And if you're just telling a story, which sometimes is what you're going to do on social media or in slightly different contexts, and I get this a lot at the MBA, for example, give me the story, tell me what you've learned, and shut the hell up, right? Because one of the most powerful things about a story is that you're not trying to tell me how the world is, what's the right way of doing things, because if I feel you pushing stuff on me, I'm going to push back. I can get defensive because I have my own opinions.
You can always get a counter example to any story, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. But if you just tell me what worked for you, I can think, interesting. That never happened to me.
Would I give that a go?
Maybe it would. Maybe in that context it might. Maybe I should consider this, right? And this is me being defensive. I might go, that is a great point. I actually never thought of it that way, and maybe that would work for me too. And then I'm convincing myself that what you learned might be a learning for me too. So I hate when people finish a story and they did everything right or more than enough things right to hit the desired impact, and they go, and that's why I encourage you. Encourage is the word that almost always comes up in that case, right? I encourage you to do this and this and that. I was like, you lost me.
And they do the voice thing usually, right? They become the story weirdo by employing their story voice or their call to action voice, getting all philosophical about life. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a nuance here that I think some people might miss, which is if you look at social media, a lot of people use stories on social media, and it's okay to use the story and then introduce a broader point, right? I see something similar happening to my clients, and then you introducing a broader point, and maybe if you have space, you substantiate that broader point. What is not okay to do, in my opinion, is this is what happened, and this is why you need to do this thing.
Without any data, without any proof that it would work for anyone else other than you in that specific situation, right? So that's when data matters.
Yeah, so I heard this described by John Livesey, who's a great speaker and storyteller. I don't know if he invented this or if he read it somewhere else, but he said there's a push strategy and a pull strategy. And when you're arguing and giving statements and facts, whatever, you're pushing things out into the world, hoping people believe you and buy your argument. And that can sometimes face pushback and defensiveness. The storytelling is so powerful because it can be a pull strategy, which is I tell you something that happened and then it pulls you towards my point of view or my world or whatever, right? But if you finish by pushing something towards people, you can end up losing a lot of the power or negating it completely, because now people will just push back.
Yeah, exactly. You've undone all the good that story has done. So in fixing this mistake, what would speakers have to do? What should they use to substantiate the story, as you said?
Sure. All they need to do is essentially not end with a call to action. Is you end the story by telling us what you've learned, although I wouldn't normally use that language. I'll try to be slightly more subtle, but you can say something like, that's when I realized that. That's a typical one. Or, from that moment on, I always did this, I never did that. That was the last time I ever whatever. That's when I finally understood that. Yeah, it's basically what have I changed either internally or in my behavior going forward. And then you shut up. Right? It's one line and you shut up.
So that's if you're just telling a story, and if it's a keynote where the story is one part.
If it's a keynote, then typically I would still tell the story the same way. And then, again, depends how you construct it, right? But you can tell the story the exact same way and say, I spend a lot of my time working in companies just like this one. And one thing that happens feels to me very similar to what my daughter was going through there. And then you make an analogy, right? You're comparing what happened to that as a way to illustrate the point and make it clearer. And then you move on to other things. Now it just depends. You can tell it in different ways. You can incorporate the next step more into the story than not. What a lot of people do, Brian, for example, likes to do this a lot, is you tell a part of the story and you get to the problem. And when you get to the problem, you go into how this problem manifests in the world in other places. And then you leave the end of the story to be maybe the last thing you do, or just about the last thing you
thread.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, you close the loop later, but then you're not going from the closed loop to a business lesson. The closed loop was about you. This is what you learned. The problem was about the corporate problem. And then it feels a lot less forced, because it's like, I just didn't have empathy with people that were different than me. Okay? I think that's not empathy with people different than you. It's very easy to transfer that to a corporate issue, right? But if you end up with a lesson about your relationship with your children, it's slightly more awkward to turn that into some sort of corporate point. Even if you do it well, it can feel sometimes artificial. So you can just do the open loop. End the beginning of the story at the problem, start talking about all the other stuff, and eventually at some point later in the keynote, close to the end, you close that loop, and then you don't need to necessarily turn your learning into a learning for the audience, unless that is a perfect match and it feels natural enough to do it.
Right. Or you can do the learning for the audience just before your own individual learning, right? That would be kind of an elegant way.
Yeah, and it can be, and sometimes it doesn't even need to be learning, because the learning could be like, maybe you didn't have a learning. Maybe you just botched it, right? And then you can either tell the audience what they can be doing and then go, I wish I had learned that. Because the next chance I had to talk to my kid, this is what happened, right? And you can say, they can still be a work in progress, right? Or you can have your learning and have your learning not necessarily be the same, because families are different than businesses, right? So there's lots of different ways to go, this is not the same, right? A lack of empathy is a lack of empathy, right? But what works with your kids doesn't necessarily work with your customers, right? And why should it? They're completely different relationships, right? But you can find some different way of I learned how to be better at that, or I still have to work at that. And, maybe the way actually I end a lot of times this story about my kids that I mentioned earlier is I talk about learning, finding a book of how to speak to children, right? And trying a whole bunch of stuff, and it's kind of funny, whatever. And I said, listen, it doesn't, I'm not going to lie that it always works, or that sometimes I just don't want to tell people what I think they should do, and for them to just listen to me and do what they're supposed to do. I don't want to have to find some different way to communicate all the time. But I'm sticking. My kids matter to me, so I'm sticking with it. Now, if talking to whoever audience I'm talking to, like whoever talk to your customers, to your team members, to whatever, matters to you too, and what you're currently doing is not working the way you want to, maybe it's time maybe it's time you make a change too, or something like that, right? So I'm not trying to say because you worked for me, it has to work for you, whatever, because I'll be forcing it. I'm just saying I changed it. It worked for me. Maybe this is not the worst idea. And to me, it was just like I close it usually by saying something like, I know what I'm asking you to do is very difficult, right? I know there's a lot of resistance. I know that doesn't feel like you should have to do this, but sometimes you have to change. And this is how I learned it. And then I tell that story. So, I just don't try to prove whatever real world point you're making by something that happened to one person one time, because that's just bad use of storytelling.
All right. So, what do folks take away from our chat today?
Some of the most common storytelling mistakes that I find all the time are people not telling a story thinking it's a story, and that's usually because they're focusing on a very large period of time instead of one thing that happened during that moment in time, during that period of time. The second problem is that they're focusing just on an external problem and not on the internal elements, the emotional stakes, why they care about that problem. The third point was around details. Either people are too generic or they put so many details in that it just becomes very difficult to follow or too artificial. And the last one was when you finish a story, instead of just focusing on what it meant to you and how it changed you, they turn it into a call to action and essentially say, because this happened to me, now I need you to live your life this way, which is annoying, fits the purpose of storytelling.
And the rule above all rules, never ever start a story with "let me tell you a story."
Or Once Upon a Time.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think people still use that one.
It's uncommon. It's uncommon, but there are modern versions of Once Upon a Time, because Once Upon a Time, so the legend goes, was because if you're a jester going from court to court and you're telling real stories about kings or important people, it will get back to you at some point that they'll chop your head off. So you made it super generic. Once upon a time in a land far away, time something time forgot. And there are modern versions of that. Is like a while back, when I was working at a tech company, I had this boss who just wasn't very nice. And the whole thing becomes generalities, right? And it's not quite as bad as Once Upon a Time, but if it becomes too vague, I'm like, did you make this up? Right? Because there's nothing in it for me to feel it's real, right? There was this person who wasn't nice and the company had some problems, right? Like, what person, what problems, it becomes too generic. So none of those things are great, and never change your voice to tell a story, because that's just weird. And there's good weird and bad weird. I would argue very strongly that is bad weird.
Stay away from that. All right. So we would love to hear story ideas from folks. If you'll share them with us, we'll get back to you as best we can, and see you on the Speaker Path.